Mark Davidson leaned back in his leather chair, the city skyline glinting through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, and let out a laugh that echoed off the glass. 60 years old, and there she was, Linda Carter, standing in front of his desk, her arms crossed, her gray hair pulled tight in a bun, clutching a folder like it was a lifeline. He didn't care what was in it. He'd already made up his mind. "You're 60, Linda," he said, smirking, his voice smooth as the bourbon he'd sipped at lunch. "Time to retire. Who needs an old-timer like you cluttering up the place? We're moving fast now, young blood, fresh ideas. You've had a good run, but let's be real. You're done." Linda stood there, her jaw tight, her fingers whitening around the folder's edges. 30 years she'd given this company, 30 years of late nights, early mornings, balancing books when the market tanked, saving accounts when the bosses didn't know their left from right. And this was how it ended, with a laugh, a shrug, and a pat on the back that felt more like a shove out the door. She swallowed hard, fighting the sting in her eyes. 30 years, Mark," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I've kept this place afloat more times than you can count. You can't just—" "Oh, I can," he cut in, waving a hand like he was swatting a fly. "And I am. Pack your desk, Linda. We'll mail your severance if there's any left after the lawyers get their cut." His smirk widened, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice to a mock whisper. "Face it, you're yesterday's news. Time to make room for the future." The room spun a little, the fluorescent lights buzzing too loud, the air too thin. Linda turned on her heel, the folder still in her grip, and walked out, her steps measured but heavy. The office outside was quiet, too quiet. Her co-workers, young faces mostly, avoided her eyes, their desks humming with keyboards and coffee cups. She made it to her cubicle, set the folder down, and sat, staring at the stacks of reports she'd spent decades perfecting. 30 years. And now this. Linda Carter wasn't new to this game. She'd started at the firm in 1993, fresh out of college with a degree in accounting and a chip on her shoulder the size of Texas. Back then, it was a different world, faxes instead of emails, ledgers instead of spreadsheets, but she'd mastered it all. She'd risen fast, became the go-to for audits, budgets, the kind of numbers that kept CEOs from sweating board meetings. But time had a way of shifting things. New blood came in, Mark among them. 10 years ago, all swagger and spreadsheets and the old guard got pushed aside. By 60, she was a ghost in her own office, her advice ignored, her desk relegated to the back corner where no one noticed. Mark was 50, sharp-suited and sharper-tongued, with a resume that screamed rising star and an ego to match. He'd taken over as CEO 3 years back, and his first move was modernization. That meant young hires, fresh MBAs, and a cold eye on anyone over 50. Dead weight. He'd call them in meetings, laughing like it was a punchline. Linda had heard the whispers her name on that list. Her age, a liability he couldn't wait to shed. Today was the breaking point. He called her in, shut the door, and delivered the verdict with that smug grin, like firing her was a favor. Worse, he'd done it in front of Sarah Miller, a 35-year-old analyst who'd been shadowing Linda for months. Sarah had stood there, wide-eyed, as Mark laughed, and Linda saw the pity in her face, pity she didn't want, didn't need. She'd walked out, head high but heart sinking, and now sat at her desk, the severance papers glaring up from the folder. No pension, no bonus, just a polite good luck and a shove into oblivion. She thought of her life outside her little house, her cat, Mr. Whiskers, who'd greet her with a meow at 5 every evening. 30 years of savings, sure, but not enough to cushion this fall. And the humiliation, Mark's laugh echoing in her ears, the way he'd made her feel small in front of everyone. She wasn't done, though. 60 or not, she had fight left, and Mark was about to find out. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the folder open, the severance letter staring back. Her hands, steady from years of balancing books, trembled just a little as she dialed her lawyer. "They can't do this, right?" she asked, voice tight. The answer was a gut punch. "Without proof, Linda, it's tough. Age discrimination's hard to nail. You need emails, memos, something concrete." She hung up, the silence heavy. No proof, just her word against Mark's, And he had the power, the lawyers, the smirk. But as she stared at the folder, an idea sparked. She wasn't beaten yet. 30 years in finance taught her one thing: follow the money. If Mark thought he could bury her, he learned she knew where the bodies were hidden. The next day, she went back to the office not to beg, but to watch. She packed her desk slow, letting the young one see her, letting Sarah catch her eye. Sarah, with her quick smile and quieter ways, had always been different, less eager to please Mark, more willing to listen when Linda explained a balance sheet. As Linda hauled her box to the elevator, Sarah slipped her a note. "Meet me at Joe's Diner, 6 p.m. I've got something." Linda's heart kicked up a notch. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. Maybe there was a way to fight back a secret plan forming in the shadows of Mark's laughter. But what was it? And could she pull it off? Linda Carter sat at the chipped Formica table in Joe's Diner, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, her eyes fixed on the door. 6 o'clock sharp, and the place was quiet, just a couple of truckers at the counter, the jukebox humming low. She'd been here since 5:45, nerves jangling like loose change, wondering if Sarah Miller would show. The note had been cryptic, slipped into her palm as she hauled her box out of the office. But it was a lifeline glimmer of something in the dark Mark Davidson had left her in. The bell jingled at 6 on the dot, and there was Sarah, 35 and sharp, in a blazer 2 sizes too big, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She scanned the room, spotted Linda, and slid into the booth opposite, her hands fidgeting with a laptop bag. "Thanks for coming," Sarah said, voice low, her eyes darting to the truckers. "I couldn't talk at the office. Too many ears." Linda leaned in, her coffee forgotten. "What you got, Sarah? That note, you said you had something." Sarah hesitated, then unzipped the bag and pulled out a stack of printouts, the edges curling from hurried copying. "Emails," she said, pushing them across the table. "From Mark, and some other shire-ups. I've been archiving stuff since he started purging old files. Thought it was just office politics, but..." She trailed off, biting her lip. Linda flipped through the pages, her heart picking up speed. Dates, times, subject lines like retirement targets, and cost-cutting Q4. One email, from Mark to the HR head, jumped out. "Carter's too old, replace her with someone who can keep up. Bonus if we can avoid severance." Another, buried deeper, talked about creative accounting to boost quarterly reports, numbers fudged, expenses hidden. Linda's breath caught. This wasn't just about her. This was bigger Mark playing fast and loose with the company's books, risking it all for a bigger bonus. She looked up, meeting Sarah's wide eyes. "Where'd you get these?" "Server backups," Sarah said, lowering her voice further. "I'm IT adjacent, I know how to dig. Mark's been sloppy, but he thinks no one's watching. He's wrong." Linda sat back, the weight of it sinking in. 30 years she'd played by the rules. And here was the proof she'd needed: Mark not just tossing her out for age, but cooking the books, endangering the whole firm. Her mind raced, the coffee shop fading as plans started forming. She could fight this not just for herself, but for everyone he'd stepped on. But first, she had to survive the fallout. The next morning, she tried her lawyer again, the emails tucked safe in a folder under her bed. "I've got proof now," she told him, voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Emails showing age discrimination and worse, financial fraud. The lawyer, a weary guy named Greg with 30 years of his own side. "That's a start, Linda, but it's thin. You'll need more witnesses, recordings, something to tie Mark directly. Courts love paper, but they love people talking even more." He hung up, leaving her with a list of next steps that felt like climbing a mountain barefoot. She spent the day pacing her living room, Mr. Whiskers watching from the couch, his yellow eyes judging her every turn. No job, no income, and now a fight that could sink her if she misstepped. The humiliation from Mark's office still burned his laugh, his smirk, the way he'd made her feel like a relic. But those emails? They were her edge, and she wasn't letting go. That afternoon, she called Sarah again, meeting her at a park this time, away from prying eyes. "We need more," Linda said, the wind rustling the papers at her lap. "Meetings, memos, anything that shows Mark's hand. Can you get it?" Sarah nodded, her face set. "I can try. He's got a big strategy session next week, execs only. I can sneak in, record it. But it's risky. If he catches me, he won't, Linda said, firm. You're smart, Sarah. We can do this. Over the next week, Linda dove in, her kitchen table turning into a war room. She dusted off her old skills spreadsheets, timelines, cross-referencing the emails with company reports she'd memorized over decades. She found patterns, Mark inflating sales figures, hiding losses in offshore accounts, all while slashing jobs to streamline. It was a house of cards, and she was about to knock it down. But Mark wasn't idle. At the office, he strutted like a king, throwing lavish parties for investors, buying art for the lobby, acting like the firm was untouchable. He didn't spare a thought for Linda, or so he thought. His emails to his cronies were smug. Carter's out, no fuss. Next up, the old guard in accounting. He laughed louder, spent faster, blind to the storm brewing. Then came the first crack. Linda rigged a cheap recorder bought from a pawn shop and started calling old contacts, posing as a journalist. Heard about changes at Davidson Financial, she'd say, her voice smooth as silk. Any dirt. Most hung up, but only retired VP named Jim spilled. Mark's cooking books, no doubt, Jim said, his voice crackling over the line. Saw him fudge numbers back in 2015. Kept quiet till now. Linda jotted it down, her pulse racing. It wasn't enough yet, but it was building. She met Sarah again, this time at a library, and the young woman handed over a thumb drive. Got the meeting, Sarah whispered, eyes wide. Mark bragging about trimming fat you mostly, and some talk about a fake contract with a shell company. Big money. Linda plugged it in, listening late that night, her cat curled beside her. Mark's voice, oily and sure, filled her living room. We're golden. No one's checking the books that close. Old biddies like Carter? Gone. New blood's where it's at. She clenched her fists, the recorder whirring. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. But the pressure was mounting. Her savings dwindled, her confidence wavered. What if she failed? What if Mark buried her deeper, laughed louder? She pushed it down, focusing on the plan. She'd take him down not just for her, but for every worker he'd dismissed, every life he'd crushed for profit. Hey, if you've ever been pushed aside just because of your age, hit that like button and drop a comment below. Tell me your story, I want to hear it. The hum of the library's fluorescent lights buzzed like a distant swarm as Linda Carter sat hunched over the thumb drive Sarah had slipped her fingers trembling slightly on the keyboard. Late night had settled in, the clock ticking past 11, but sleep was the last thing on her mind. The recordings played through her earbuds. Mark Davidson's voice, slick and arrogant, bragging about trimming fat and dodging questions about a shell company deal that smelled like a scam. Each word was a nail in the coffin he didn't know he was building, and Linda felt the pieces click into place. She'd been chasing shadows for weeks, mails, old contacts, scraps of proof, but this was different. This was the key. Tucked in the middle of the recording was a mention of a contract with Horizon Partners, a name she recognized from her days auditing overseas accounts. Back then, it was a legit firm. Now, it was a ghost, a front Mark used to funnel money out of Davidson Financial. If she could tie that to him, it wasn't just age discrimination, it was fraud, big enough to sink him and the company both. Her heart raced as she pulled out her old ledger books, the ones she'd kept since '93, their pages yellowed but precise. She cross-referenced the dates, the figures, the cryptic notes Mark had made during that exec meeting. There was a forged signature on a document dated last June, claiming Horizon Partners had invested $10 million. But she knew better. No such deal existed. She checked the SEC filings herself, late nights at her kitchen table, Mr. Whiskers purring at her feet. It was a lie, a paper trail leading straight to Mark's greed. Linda sat back, the chair creaking under her, and let the weight of it sink in. This wasn't just revenge for her firing, it was a chance to expose a rot that went deeper than she'd imagined. Mark wasn't just a bully. He was a crook, and she had the proof. But what now? Hand it over to the authorities? Leak it to the press? Her mind spun, the library's quiet pressing in, a contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She thought of Mark's laugh that day in his office, the way he'd leaned back, smug, like she was nothing. 30 years of her life, reduced to a punchline. And Sarah Young, brave Sarahhood, risked her job to help. Linda couldn't let that go to waste. She grabbed her phone, fingers hesitating over the keypad, then dialed Greg, her lawyer. "I found it," she said when he picked up, her voice steady now, sure. "A fake contract. Mark's been skimming. We've got him." Greg whistled low. "That's heavy, Linda. You sure? If this blows, he's not just out of Job's facing jail time. And you'll be in the crosshairs." "I'm sure," she said, no doubt left. "I'm sending you the files. But we need more witnesses, maybe, or a statement from someone who saw him sign it." He agreed, promising to dig, and Linda hung up, her mind racing to the next step. She couldn't do this alone, not anymore. The next morning, she met Sarah at a coffee shop, the air thick with the smell of burnt beans and possibility. "We got to go public," Linda said, leaning close over her latte. "But carefully. I don't want Mark burying this before it sticks." Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with nerves and excitement. "I can get you into the next board meeting unofficially. They're discussing Q2 profits next week. If Mark slips up, we record it. But it's risky. He's paranoid now, watching everyone." "Do it," Linda said, firm. "We can't wait." That week, she prepared polishing the evidence, rehearsing her pitch, calling old colleagues who might back her up. One, a retired CFO named Ellen, agreed to testify. "I saw him fudge numbers back in 2010, Ellen said, her voice crackling over the phone. "Thought he cleaned up his act. Guess not." Another, Jim from sales, chimed in with stories of Mark's lavish, spending private jets, art auctions while the rank and file got pink slips. By Friday, Linda felt the plan solidify. She'd send a contract and recordings to the SEC and a reporter at the city's biggest paper, the Herald. It was a gamble. Mark could retaliate, smear her name, but she had to risk it. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the thumb drive in one hand, Mr. Whiskers brushing against her leg. She typed the email slow, attaching every thingimails, recordings, Ellen's statement. The subject line read, "Urgent, fraud at Davidson Financial." Her finger hovered over send, doubt creeping in. What if they didn't believe her? What if Mark found out first? But then she thought of that moment in Mark's office's laugh, his smugness, and the doubt burned away. She hit send, the whoosh of the email a quiet victory. It was out there now, a spark that could ignite or fizzle. She didn't know which, but she'd lit the match. The next morning, the city woke up to a different kind of buzz. Linda's phone rang at 6, Greg's voice urgent. "It's breaking," he said. "The Herald's running a teaser online financial firm under investigation for fraud. They've got your tip." Her heart leapt, then sank. This was a point of no return. Mark would know soon, if he didn't already, and she'd be in his sights. She spent the day waiting, jumping at every noise, her mind spinning scenarios. Would he come for her? Call her bluff? By afternoon, a text from Sarah confirmed it. He's freaking out. Board's an emergency session. Linda exhaled, a mix of relief and dread. She'd started this, and now was rolling fast, hard, and out of her hands. But a question lingered. Had she moved too late? Could Mark still bury her before the truth came out? The stakes were higher now, the game dirtier, and Linda knew she had to stay sharp. Her secret plan was in motion, but would it be enough? A gray dawn broke over the city, casting long shadows through Linda Carter's quiet street as she sat at her kitchen window, clutching a mug of tea that had gone cold hours ago. The Herald's teaser story had hit the night before just a hint of fraud at Davidson Financial. No names yet, but it was enough to set her nerves on edge. She'd barely slept, jumping at every creak of her old house, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The SEC had her files, the press had her tip, and Mark Davidson was out there, somewhere, waking up to a nightmare he didn't see coming. By 8, the storm broke wide open. Her phone buzzed with a news alert, the headlines screaming across the screen. Davidson Financial rocked by fraud allegations, CEO under fire. The article was sparse anonymous sources, whispers of forged contracts, but it named Mark, tied him to financial irregularities, and promised more to come. Linda scrolled through, her pulse hammering, as the TV blared the same story. Stock prices tumbling, investors pulling out, the board scrambling. She'd done the Isher's secret plan, her years of know-how, all boiling down to this moment. Sarah texted at 8:30, her message short and frantic. Office is chaos. Mark's screaming at everyone. They're digging for the leak. Linda typed back a quick stay safe, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline. She knew Mark lash out, claw his way out of this if he could. But the evidence was ironclad. Emails, recordings, that fake Horizon Partners deal. He couldn't bury it not this time. The twist hit at noon. Linda was pacing her living room, Mr. Whiskers watching from his perch, when the doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. She froze, half expecting Mark himself, but it was a delivery guy, a plain envelope in his hand. No return address, just her name scrawled in black ink. She signed for it, her gut twisting, and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet, typed and unsigned. You should watch your back, Linda. Some secrets stay buried for a reason. Her breath caught, the paper trembling in her grip. A threat vague, chilling, but real. Mark knew, or someone did. She was in the crosshairs now. Her phone rang a minute later. Greg, her lawyer, his voice tight. You see the news? SEC's raiding their offices today. Mark's in deep, but this threat, Linda, you need to lay low. He's got money connections. He could hit back. I'm not hiding, she said, her voice harder than she felt. He doesn't scare me. But she locked the doors anyway, checked the windows, the unease settling like damp rot. The day dragged on. The TV looping footage of suits storming Davidson Financial. Mark's face pale as he ducked into a car. Social media exploded hashtags like Justice for Linda trending, strangers cheering her on. It should have felt good, but that note kept her on edge. What if he came for her? What if he turned this around? By evening, the darkest hour loomed. Greg called again, his tone grim. Mark's spinning it. Claims he's the victim, says a disgruntled ex-employee faked the docs. He's pointing at you, Linda. No proof yet, but he's loud. She sank onto the couch, the weight of it crushing. 30 years of integrity, and he'd smear her name to save his skin. The stock was tanking down 40% and the board was in crisis, but Mark was fighting dirty. If he convinced them, if he twisted this, she'd lose everything, her reputation, her savings, her shot at justice. She sat there, the threat note crumpled beside her, doubt clawing at her resolve. Had she pushed too far? Could he really bury her again? Laugh louder this time? The room spun, Mr. Whiskers nudging her hand, and for a moment, she felt 60-old, tired, outmatched. But then Sarah's voice broke through, a call cutting the silence. He slipped, she said, breathless. Board meeting today admitted the Horizon deal was his idea. Tried to pin it on a junior VP. I got on tape. Sending it now. Linda's breath steadied as the file hit her inbox. She played at Mark's voice, panicked but clear. I signed off on Horizon, sure, but Jenkins pushed it. I trusted him. A lie, and a bad one. Jenkins was a kid, barely 2 years in. This was gold. Mark hanging himself with his own words. The doubt burned away, replaced by fire. He wasn't winning this. She called Greg back, her plans snapping into focus. We're not just playing defense, she said. I'm suing themage discrimination, wrongful termination, the works. Use the fraud as leverage. They'll settle fast to keep this quiet. Greg hesitated, then agreed. Bold move, Linda. Let's do it. The next morning, she walked into the courthouse with Greg, her head high, her gray hair catching the light. The suit was filed. Linda Carter versus Davidson Financial, a claim for 30 years of service turned to dust, backed by the chaos Mark had sown. She handed over the new recording, the emails, Ellen's testimony, everything. The clerk stamped it, and Linda felt the shift victim to Victor, 60 and unbowed. Outside, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, but she kept walking, her steps firm. Mark had threatened all he wanted, lost control, and she'd taken it. The plan wasn't over, not yet. She had one more move, and he'd never see it coming. The courthouse steps gleamed wet under a late April drizzle as the crowd thinned out, reporters scattering with their sound bites, and Linda Carter's lawsuit filed tight in their notebooks. Inside, the air had been thick with tension. Greg laying out her case, The clerk stamped a quiet thunder, but out here, Linda felt the world shift under her feet. 60 years old, gray hair damp against her neck, she stood taller than she had in months, the weight of Mark Davidson's laughter finally lifting. She played her hand, and now the game was ending. By noon, the fallout was everywhere. The Herald ran the full story. Davidson Financial CEO faces fraud charges. Ex-employee sues for age discrimination, and the details poured out. The fake Horizon Partners deal, Mark's recorded admission, emails proving he'd targeted older workers like Linda. The SEC moved fast, freezing his accounts, while the board ousted him in an emergency vote. His corner office emptied before the ink dried. Stocks hit rock bottom, down 60% in a weekend. Investors bailed, leaving the firm a husk of what it had been. Mark didn't go quietly. Cameras caught him outside the office, tie loose, shouting at a reporter. "This is a witch hunt. Carter faked it all. She's bitter, washed up." But no one bought it. The evidence was a tidal wave. Ellen's testimony, Sarah's tapes, 30 years of Linda's meticulous records, and his lies drowned in it. By evening, he was a pariah, his name toxic, his fortune locked away pending trial. Fraud wasn't just a firing off in sight, was prison, and he was staring down years. Linda watched it unfold from her living room. Mr. Whiskers curled beside her, the TV flickering with Mark's unraveling. Greg called at 7, his voice lighter than she'd ever heard. "They're settling," he said. "Company's desperate, offering big to keep it quiet. You're getting full back pay, a pension bump, and they're compensating every worker over 50 they axed unfairly. You won, Linda." She exhaled, the victory sinking in slow. Not just for her, for everyone Mark had dismissed, laughed at, erased. The next day, she walked into the courthouse again, this time to sign the papers. Mark was there, court-ordered, flanked by lawyers, his smirk gone, replaced by a hollow stare. He caught her eye as she passed, stepping close, his voice a rasp. "You happy now, Carter? You won. Ruined me. Satisfied?" Linda stopped, turned, and met his gaze, steady and unyielding. "I didn't ruin you, Mark," she said, her tone calm, cutting. "You did that yourself. I just took back what I deserved." He flinched, no comeback left, and she walked away, head high, leaving him to stew in the wreckage he'd built. The high came after, a quiet thrill she hadn't expected. With the settlement 6 figures, more than she dreamed, she did something Mark never saw coming. The stock was dirt cheap now, the firm a wounded giant, and Linda bought in. Not much, just enough, a few thousand shares at pennies on the dollar. When the dust settled, the company restructured, desperate to survive, and she emerged a shareholder, a voice in the room she'd been kicked out of. 60 years old, and she'd turned the tables. Months later, she sat in a board meeting, her first as a stakeholder, gray hair gleaming under the lights, her presence a silent rebuke. The new CEO, a woman who'd climbed from the ranks, nodded her way, and Linda spoke up, pushing policies Mark would have hated. Fair hiring, no age caps, value for experience. The room listened, really listened, and she saw it, the shift she'd forced. Mark was gone, last seen selling his condo, a shadow of the man who'd laughed her out, but the firm wasn't. It'd heal, and she'd made sure it wouldn't forget. That night, she stood at her kitchen window, the city twinkling beyond, Mr. Whiskers purring at her feet. The threat note was long burned, the fear a memory. She'd won not just money, not just justice, but respect, the kind Mark never understood. Experience wasn't a burden, it was a weapon, and she'd wielded it sharper than he'd ever dreamed. Here's the truth. Don't let anyone tell you age is a limit. It's a strength, a story, a fight waiting to happen. Linda proved it, and maybe you've seen it too, someone written off, rising up. What's your take? Drop it in the comments side. Love to hear it. Let's keep this going. And hey, thanks for riding this one out with me. It's been a hell of a story, and I'm glad you're here. If it hit you anywhere real, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and share it with someone who needs it. More is coming. Check out the next video when you can. See you soon.